Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. When I read books, I don't see pictures. All I see are the words on the page, the words telling me that the dress was yellow, the words detailing a dark and damp forest, the words telling me that he was a brunette who has a scar across his arm. But I can't see anything other than the words dark, brunette, scar, or yellow. I never thought much of my lack of imagination. I thought that was how everyone's brains worked. In fact, I thought, cartoons and films illustrating characters' imaginations were fictional conceptualizations and arguably propagandistic ploys to encourage children to read more, in the same way, Father Christmas is used to coax children to behave all year round. The idea that people saw things in their heads whilst awake seemed as realistic as a character in a cartoon learning to breathe underwater, and I wasn't made aware of any of my differences until my late teens, and even then, if I'm being honest, I thought the people who said they had an imagination were completely lying, trying to be more special. In fact, the first time I believed someone when they said they had an imagination was in my early 20s, and I was working in a bookshop as a bookseller, and I was working alongside this incredibly enthusiastic bookseller who would go on and on about world building and maps and all these kind of layouts of a fantasy world that he read, and the intensity of the detail that he gave me caused me to question everything. I thought to myself, what if people aren't lying when they say they see things in their heads, and in fact, I am the odd one out? Well, turns out I am. So first let's ask, what is an imagination? Imagination, a licentious and vagrant faculty, unsusceptible of limitations and impatient of restraint, has always endeavoured to baffle the logician, to perplex the confines of distinction, and burst the enclosures of regularity, so said Samuel Johnson in The Rambler. The human imagination is how a person's brain simulates something based on knowledge or past experiences. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy describes the act of imagining as, quote, representing without aiming at things as they actually presently or subjectively are. One can use imagination to represent possibilities other than the actual, to represent times other than the present, and to represent perspectives other than one's own. Unlike perceiving and believing, imagining something does not require one to consider that something to be the case. Unlike desiring or anticipating, imagining something does not require one to wish or expect that something to be the case. The human imagination has intrigued philosophers and psychologists for centuries. For Aristotle, the imagination, or as he called it, fantasia, which is a loose translation on the concept of imagination, though not exactly the same thing, this idea of fantasia bridged the gap between sensation and thought. Philosophers René Descartes and Immanuel Kant offered contrasting views on the nature and significance of imagination. For Descartes, imagination was unimportant, as it dealt with images that could be doubted and they weren't grounded in truth and reality. In fact, the imagination threatened one's access to truth, as the imagination could technically manipulate sensory data. However, for Kant, human imagination was an essential feature for the human mind. Taking a more Aristotelian standpoint, Kant believed that imagination bridged the sensory and the intellectual faculties of the brain to create a cohesive comprehension of the world. Dr. Michael Beanie, who has written extensively about the philosophy of imagination and who actually has a free little written course on the subject, which you can read for yourself, I will link it in the description box down below. Anyway, he writes about the loss of imagination in a way that is quite devastating for someone such as myself to read. So Dr. Beanie writes, "What would life be like without imagination? Perhaps in this very question we have found something that is impossible to imagine. Imagination infuses so much of what we do and so deeply that to imagine its absence is to imagine not being human. And lo, behold the non-human creature." So before we go any further about all the jazzy things, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank today's paid sponsor, which is Squarespace. I love my Squarespace website. I love blogging in general. I've just started my first I've had my website for a while. I've had all of my main business websites for the past few years with Squarespace because it's just so easy. And I've started up a new section on there. I'm getting a new podcast put together. It's so exciting. And I'm doing it all from Squarespace. It's so easy because Squarespace is so intuitive about building up your business or your website how you want it. You could expand it in whatever way you want, whether that's, through making courses for your followers or a newsletter or selling products. You can do it all on Squarespace and it's just incredible. I don't have to do any coding with Squarespace. It's so easy. You just drag and drop what you want where you want it. You can have member areas and you can sell courses or have a little podcast back there, or you can create an email campaign option and you can organize your email newsletters all from Squarespace. You don't have to have lots of different other websites. Or you can open shops on there and link it all together. And what's fantastic is you can look at how your website can grow by looking at the built-in analytics feature that gives you insight into who is visiting your site, the traffic sources, the time they spend there, the most popular content they read on there, the geography of your audience, and so much more. So if you want to keep expanding your business in the new year, or just build a beautiful website for your leisure, then go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Lady of the Library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Okay, so why is imagination important? Human imaginations exist on a spectrum of vividness, with some people having stronger imaginations than others. Those at the highest end have what is known as hyperphantasia, an ability to see images at a photorealistic, cinematic quality level in their mind. Then there are 4 more levels below that, with imaginations ranging from reasonably realistic to vague imagery. And then there are those who visualise nothing at all. Now, to be clear, there are 2 types of people in this world who lack an imagination of sorts. There are those who are born without one, and then there are those who are lost. Those who are born without an imagination are known as having aphantasia, an inability to form mental images when thinking. Aphantasia can affect anywhere between 1 to 5% of the population, and it impacts a person's ability to see memories, recognise faces, have dreams, or be able to create vivid dreams, or imagine their future or hypothetical situations. Now, it's important to stress that experts don't define aphantasia as a medical condition, a disability, or a disorder. It's merely a way of being as much as one has preferences for certain tastes or smells in life. Then there are those who have lost their imagination, which is probably the most common amongst those who suffer from PTSD, though not all, or who have been affected by trauma. The difference between those with aphantasia and those with traumatic imagination loss is that the latter are usually still very capable of recalling details of traumatic events, vividly able to relive events from the past or see faces which haunt them, or also have horrifying nightmares in great detail. However, they struggle to see images in a positive context, so they may struggle to visualize a future for themselves, or see images whilst they're reading, or engage with their imagination for play, etc. Now, I don't know when I lost my imagination. Were I to make an educated guess, I would say it happened around the age of 6 or 7, because that's my earliest memories of when my trauma started. However, the reason I'm talking about this is that I recently received a video request from a follower called Miriam, and it reads as follows. It says, quote, "You mentioned that you don't have an imagination. How do you believe it affects your reading experience exactly, and in what specific scenarios might your approach be better than imagination? How would someone who has been exclusively using imagination when reading try your method?" Well, honestly, my gut response would be, please don't try and read as I do. I mean, firstly, I wouldn't describe my way of reading without an imagination as being a method because I don't choose to do it that way. Given the option, and my main concern whilst reading this comment was that my mentioning that I don't have an imagination when reading, coupled with my academic status as a PhD student, may have been interpreted by some as a reading without imagination, signalling a more mature, academic or cultured way of reading, which is simply not true in the slightest, and I wanted to make this video to emphasise that. I certainly wouldn't encourage people to get rid of their imagination or read without one, and I don't think it's possible, honestly, for someone to read this way unless their brain is that way inclined. I don't think anyone with an imagination can turn it off as much as I'm incapable of turning on mine. Now, although I can't compare and contrast reading with an imagination with reading without, I can only guess, based on what people have told me, that reading without an imagination is a poorer experience overall, and I certainly can't think of any benefits to reading without an imagination, aside from never being disappointed by the casting choices in a book to film adaptation. Because I don't know what they look like anyway. Having an imagination is crucial for problem solving, innovation, being able to cope with change, expressing oneself, and living a fulfilling life. Though conversations about the benefits of nurturing one's imagination tend to focus on the importance of imagination in child development, it's equally as important in adulthood, if not probably more important. Your imagination allows you to think through your life critically, be excited by your future and your future prospects, change your whole outlook on life, inspire creativity, write stories, paint things, draw things, challenge the status quo, innovate, advance your career, engage in art and culture, and strengthen your analytical and conflict resolution skills, your emotional intelligence, and nurture your empathy and compassion. In The Body Keeps the Score, a seminal text on healing trauma, Bessel van der Kolk writes, quote, "Imagination gives us the opportunity to envision new possibilities. It is an essential launchpad for making our hopes come true. When people are compulsively and constantly pulled back into the past, the last time they felt intense involvement and deep emotions, they suffer from the failure of imagination, a loss of mental flexibility. Without imagination, there is no hope. No chance to envision a better future, no place to go, no goal to reach." I mean, okay, maybe asking a reader without an imagination how not having an imagination affects their reading experience is probably like asking a left-handed person affects them. It's probably almost impossible to answer because we don't know any differently, though ironically, at least a left-handed person will have the ability to imagine an alternative right-handed lifestyle, unlike me. So I can only assume that reading as an experience is probably less fun for me, technically, if we're being honest. You see, when I hear other people talk in great depth about fantasy worlds that they saw, maps of the countries they could see in their head, and the intricate physical details of characters and their mannerisms, what characters' houses look like, or what fictional landscapes appear like, they seem to have a far more entertaining experience with fiction than I do. Additionally, I likely have less patience for certain books than the average reader, with detail-heavy narratives boring me to tears, and I probably give good books much lower review ratings on Goodreads than they deserve because I never become part of the world that the author creates, which I just possibly can't. For me to enjoy literature, I primarily rely on strong and engaging narrative voices and vocabulary, characterizations, and a good plot. However, as settings and aesthetics play no role in my reading experience, I tend to dislike books that rely heavily on them. Quelle surprise! Or books that depend on them for the plot to be understood, which tends to be most commonly historical, fantasy, and sci-fi books. You tend to need an imagination to understand what's going on, otherwise it just doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. So, whilst I lack certain intimate experiences and relationships with books, especially of those particular genres, my experience with reading is no less fulfilling from my perspective, as I've never experienced the alternative, but I can't speak for everyone who shares my mind blindness, as it's known, because there will be others who have experienced both sides of the imagination spectrum, and they may miss the way that they used to read books before it. And if you're one of those people, let people know down below in the comments section and share your experiences so other people know what the differences are. However, I thought about this quite in depth because childhood is beautiful because of the expansive imagination afforded to innocent minds. But if you're a reader with an imagination, you can tap into that resource and it's just as beautiful. So embrace, engage, and nourish your imagination at every opportunity you possibly can. Daydream, draw, get lost in fictional worlds, and just let your beautiful brain work with the text the way it wants to. There is nothing childish or unsophisticated about letting your imagination flourish and reading with an imagination. I hope that was interesting. If you thought so, please consider subscribing or liking this video and leaving a comment down below. I also always have my video request form in the description box down below, so you can send a request just like Miriam did for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, be happy and healthy, and books save lives, so keep reading. Hello. Now, what did you drop on my lap that you were eating? That's what I want to know. Okay, one done.